You know that iconic image of the Star of Bethlehem shining bright, guiding the wise men? It's a story we're diving into today, and you specifically asked for this one. We're going straight to the source, or at least someone who really dug deep into the source. The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View by Adair. This isn't just some light holiday read, this is some serious investigation.
A skeptical view, huh?
Huh?
That's definitely an angle you don't hear every day.
Right. Adair doesn't hold back. He digs into history, astronomy, all the theories, and really challenges what we think we know about the Star of Bethlehem.
I'm intrigued already.
Me too. It's like we all know the story from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, right? The star appears, the Magi follow it, they find baby Jesus. But how much of that is actually, historically accurate? That's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, well, Adair points out something important right away. Matthew was writing decades, maybe even longer, after these events supposedly happened.
Oh, okay. So right off the bat, we've got a bit of a time gap.
Exactly. And not only that, but he doesn't tell us where he got his information or how he checked if it was true.
Wow, so it's like writing a biography based on rumors and hearsay, not exactly reliable.
And by the time Matthew was writing, anyone who might have actually seen the slare would have been long gone.
That's a really good point. It's amazing how a story we hear so much can suddenly seem, I don't know, kind of shaky when you start looking at it like this. But okay, let's say we put those concerns aside for now. What about all the theories, right? Comets, supernovas, planetary alignments. There's got to be something there, right?
Adair goes through them all: comets, novae, even supernovae, which are basically massive star explosions.
Wow, covering all the bases.
He even looks at those planetary conjunctions where planets appear close together in the sky.
Right, like that Jupiter and Saturn conjunction some people talk about.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing. As good as these theories might sound, Adair systematically dismantles each one.
Oh, no way. So there's no easy answer. Part of me was hoping for a aha, it was a comet all along kind of thing.
It's way more interesting than that. Adair basically shows how these theories contradict either what Matthew describes or what we know from historical astronomical records.
So you're telling me, with all our modern science, we still can't say for sure what the Star of Bethlehem was?
It's even more complicated than that. Adair argues that even if we ignore all that historical and astronomical stuff, the language Matthew uses just doesn't match up with anything we know about the natural world.
Wait, hold on. The actual words hold the key here.
It's all about the details. Matthew describes the star going before them as they traveled south. But the Greek word he uses, proago, suggests a movement that's impossible for any star or planet.
So one word, one tiny detail could change everything.
That's amazing. It's like finding a loose thread and the whole thing unravels.
And there's more. He also points to the phrase stood over, describing the star's position above Jesus, histemi in Greek. That kind of pinpoint accuracy, stopping over a specific house. Comets, planets, they just don't work that way. They're always moving.
Okay, you've definitely got me rethinking everything I thought I knew about the Star of Bethlehem. So where does that leave us? If it wasn't a comet, wasn't a supernova, wasn't some astronomical event, was Matthew just, making stuff up? Well, not necessarily. This is where things get really interesting. Adair doesn't just dismiss the star. Instead, he dives into the culture and the history and tries to understand why Matthew might have included this specific story.
Okay, so more context. Got it.
Exactly. You got to remember, back then, astrology, astronomy, it was all kind of blended together. People believed the stars could, directly influence events on Earth.
Right, like how people used to blame a bad harvest on the position of Mars or something.
Exactly. So when Matthew describes the star standing over Jesus, he's tapping into that belief system, using astronomical imagery to convey a theological message, even if the actual event wasn't meant to be taken literally.
So it's more about the message, the meaning behind it, than the literal event.
Right. Think about the audience back then, the language they understood. It was a way of speaking to them, using their beliefs to convey a deeper meaning.
Makes sense. But what about the Magi, the wise men? They're kind of a big deal in this whole story, right?
Here's the thing about the Magi. We tend to picture them as these, super astrologers spending all night studying the skies. But Adair suggests they might not have been astrologers in the way we think of them today.
Wait, hold on. So they weren't out there looking for astronomical clues. What were they doing then?
Well, Adair thinks Matthew's portrayal of the Magi might be heavily influenced by Old Testament prophecies, like the ones in Isaiah.
Isaiah?
Yeah, Isaiah talks about kings coming from the east, bringing gifts, recognizing the Messiah. It's like Matthew is taking these prophecies and using the Magi to represent them, these Gentiles coming to worship Jesus.
So the Magi are more like symbolic figures than actual historical figures.
That's one interpretation.
Mm,
So if that's the case, what about the star itself? If it wasn't a real astronomical event, what was it doing in the story?
good question. It feels like we're going in circles a bit.
Well, one possibility Adair brings up is that the star might be a literary device, connecting Jesus to those Old Testament prophecies about a star rising out of Jacob, signaling to the audience that he's the fulfillment of those prophecies.
Okay, so it's like the story is rooted in scripture, draws on existing narratives and prophecies, and uses this powerful image, this astronomical image, to convey a deeper theological point, like a tapestry, all these different threads coming together.
Exactly. That's one of the things I find so fascinating about Adair's work. He makes you question everything, look beyond the surface.
It's like we've been looking at this story in 2 dimensions, and he just handed us a pair of 3D glasses. But I have to ask, if the Star of Bethlehem might be more symbolic than literal, what does that mean for how we understand the whole Christmas story?
That's a big question, and Adair tackles it head on. He argues that even if we accept that the star might not have been a literal event, the core of the Christmas story, the hope, the redemption, that's all still there, still powerful, still relevant.
It's like the wrapping paper might change, but the gift inside is still the same.
Exactly. Adair's suggesting that by getting hung up on the historical accuracy, we might be missing the bigger picture, the spiritual significance.
So it's about shifting our perspective, looking beyond the physical details to the deeper meaning.
Right, sometimes the most important truths aren't found in facts and figures, but in stories, myths, symbols that resonate with us on a deeper level.
You know, I always loved the story of the Star of Bethlehem, but I never thought of it quite like this before. It's both freeing and a little overwhelming to realize how much depth there is to it.
It reminds us that sometimes the most enduring truths aren't conveyed through science or history, but through stories and symbols that resonate with the human experience. And the Star of Bethlehem, whether it was a real event or not, has definitely captured our imaginations for centuries.
And that's the beauty of a good deep dive, isn't it? We started with what seemed like a simple question and ended up exploring the very nature of belief, the power of stories, and the enduring mystery at the heart of this holiday. You know, it's funny, isn't it? We started with this one image, the Star of Bethlehem, and look where we are now. Tell me about it. It's like Adair took us down a rabbit hole of history and astronomy and biblical interpretation.
And it's not over yet. Adair brings up some other really interesting points later in the book. For example, he talks about how the Magi, those wise men, remember, well, they weren't just any wise men.
Oh, right, I think I remember this part.
They were actually Zoroastrian priests from Persia.
Wait, really?
Yeah, which means they weren't just stargazers, they were part of a whole other religion.
Wow, that adds a whole other layer to this, doesn't it?
Right. I mean, here you have these religious experts traveling all the way to find the Jewish Messiah following a star.
When they already had their own savior figure in Zoroastrianism.
Exactly. It's like, what were the odds? Like, imagine if the Dalai Lama suddenly showed up in Rome claiming to have followed a shooting star to find the new pope.
That's quite the image. Right, so it makes you wonder, what was Matthew trying to say by including that detail about the Magi?
It's almost like he's using them to show that the message of Christianity was meant for everyone, not just one group of people.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like even back then, the story was already breaking down barriers. Oh, and there's one more thing I have to tell you about. Adair brings up this fascinating parallel between the Magi visiting Herod and a real historical event.
Okay. Oh,
So there was this Armenian king, Tiridates, and he traveled all the way to Rome to meet the Emperor Nero.
right. I think I've heard of that. He was paying homage or something.
Exactly. And Adair's point is, if this huge event with the Magi and Herod actually happened, wouldn't there be some other record of it somewhere?
Right, like we were saying before about George Washington, there would be other accounts, wouldn't there?
Exactly. But there's nothing, it's like the historical record just goes silent. It's another one of those details that makes you wonder about the whole Star of Bethlehem story, you know?
It really makes you think about what we accept as history and how much of it is based on, well, faith, I guess.
That's a good way to put it. And you know, after all this, I keep coming back to this one thought. Even if the Star of Bethlehem wasn't a real event, in the literal sense, the story itself is still so powerful.
It really is. It's resonated with people for centuries, for a reason.
Right. And maybe that's the most important thing. Maybe the real question isn't about whether the star was a comet or a supernova or whatever. Maybe it's about why this story still matters to us after all this time.
I think you're onto something. Maybe it's about that human need for hope, for something bigger than ourselves.
Like that image of the star shining in the darkness, it's a powerful symbol no matter what you believe.
It reminds us that there's still mystery in the world, and that sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones we can't fully explain.
That's beautifully said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. We started with a simple question about the Star of Bethlehem, and look where we ended up. It's been quite a journey exploring history, astronomy, even theology, all thanks to one skeptical book.
It just goes to show sometimes the most fascinating journeys are the ones we don't expect.
Absolutely. This is one deep dive I won't soon forget. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this exploration.